The Libyan desert was a furnace by day and a grave by night. In the summer of 1942, the war in North Africa had become a contest of ghosts. Men who appeared from nowhere, struck fast, and vanished into the endless sand. Among those ghosts was a new breed of soldier. They weren't the regular army. They were David Stirling's SAS, Special Air Service, a secret unit formed under the nose of the British High Command, born from frustration and rebellion. At Cabret Camp, near the Suez Canal, the idea of the SAS had started as a madman's dream. Stirling, a tall Scotsman from a family of aristocrats, had broken his back during a training jump. Unable to walk properly, he limped into British headquarters with a wild proposal. A handful of men could do more damage than 1,000 if they struck deep behind enemy lines. He wasn't supposed to get approval, but Churchill loved madmen who promised results. By July 1942, Stirling had his unit, L Detachment, SAS Brigade. Their mission: destroy the Axis air power in North Africa, the lifeblood of Rommel's Africa Corps. Without planes, Rommel's tanks would be blind, stranded, and starved of supplies. Among Stirling's recruits was Lieutenant Paddy Mayne, an Irishman built like a boulder and feared by his own comrades. Before the war, he'd been a rugby champion and had once punched his commanding officer. Now he was Stirling's hammer. The men trained in unbearable heat. They learned to navigate by stars, sleep in dunes, and survive on half a canteen of water. Their transport: Willys jeeps stripped of armor, loaded with Vickers K machine guns and extra fuel tanks. They called them desert chariots. By nightfall, the desert was their ocean. They traveled hundreds of miles into enemy territory, with no radio contact, no backup, and no rescue if things went wrong. One raid in particular would become legend. Target: the Axis airfield at Sidi Hanaish. Date: July 26, 1942. Objective: destroy as many German and Italian aircraft as possible before dawn. It was the raid that changed North Africa. The moment when a few dozen men in dusty jeeps crippled Rommel's air arm and proved that courage could rewrite strategy. In the silence of the desert night, Stirling gathered his men around the jeeps. He spoke quietly, almost as if afraid to break the stillness. "Gentlemen, tonight we're not soldiers, we're ghosts. When the sun rises, the enemy must wonder if we ever existed." The men smiled grimly. Engines whispered to life. Jeep convoys slithered into the darkness, heading north. Overhead, the Milky Way burned, their only map, their only light. No one knew if they'd return. The night of July 26, 1942, was moonless, a blessing for men whose lives depended on shadows. In the Libyan desert, a convoy of 18 jeeps crept across the dunes, engines muffled, headlights covered. Each jeep carried 2 Vickers K guns mounted on the front and sides, and rows of Lewis bombs, small, sticky explosives designed to destroy aircraft without a sound. At the head of the column rode Captain David Stirling, goggles pulled tight, eyes scanning the horizon. To his right was Lieutenant Paddy Mayne, the Irishman whose temper had once gotten him court-martialed, now leading one of the most daring missions of the war. They had been traveling for 3 days, over 400 miles through Axis-held territory. Navigation was done by compass, starlight, and instinct. Every stop was measured, every noise counted. They'd buried empty fuel cans in the sand to cover their tracks. Ahead lay Sidi Hanaish Airfield, a key Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica base supplying Rommel's Africa Corps. Over 60 enemy aircraft sat on its runways: Messerschmitts, Junkers, Machis, the machines that dominated the desert skies. The plan was simple, suicidal, and brilliant. Stirling divided his men into 2 groups. Mayne's section would hit the western end of the airfield. Stirling's section would strike from the east. They would meet in the middle, lay explosives, and retreat under cover of chaos. The desert was silent except for the low growl of engines. A faint wind carried the smell of oil and sand. Every man knew. One wrong turn, one flare, and they'd be surrounded. Then, from the darkness, the airfield appeared. A faint glimmer of metal wings under the stars. The men stopped. Engines cut. Stirling raised his hand. "Remember," he whispered, "every minute counts. We get in, destroy, and vanish. No second chances." The jeeps rolled forward, slow at first, then faster. By the time they reached the perimeter, they were moving at full speed. The first German sentry never saw them. A burst from Mayne's twin Vickers guns cut through the night. Within seconds, the SAS convoy was on the runway, firing into rows of aircraft. Tracer rounds streaked through the dark like fiery ropes. Fuel tanks ignited. Wings exploded. One after another, Luftwaffe bombers burst into flames, lighting up the desert like a sunrise of fire. Men shouted in German, running for cover. Mayne leapt from his jeep, sprinting between planes, slapping Lewis bombs onto fuselages. He worked with terrifying precision, pulling the pins, counting seconds, moving on. That's number 6. Number 7. He'd later write in his diary, "It was like setting fire to the sky." Stirling's section drove straight down the runway, gunning down trucks, fuel stores, and anything that moved. At one point, a machine gun nest opened fire, bullets tearing through canvas seats. Private reg seekings returned fire, cutting the gunner down with a short, cold burst. Within minutes, the entire airfield was a storm of flame. Over 30 enemy aircraft were already destroyed, with more erupting every second. Then came the signal. 3 green flares fired from Mayne's jeep, the order to withdraw. The SAS wheeled their jeeps around, engines screaming, racing back into the night as explosions chased them across the desert. Behind them, the airfield burned so bright it could be seen for 50 miles. By dawn, they were gone, swallowed by the dunes. Not a single man lost. Only silence remained, where once had stood the pride of the Luftwaffe. The raid destroyed over 40 aircraft, a dozen fuel trucks, and paralyzed Axis operations in Cyrenaica for weeks. Rommel's supply lines were blinded, his air cover crippled. German high command was furious. They believed a battalion-sized force had attacked. In truth, it was fewer than 50 men. Churchill called it a blow struck from the shadows. The legend of the SAS, born in secrecy, was now written in fire. In the war diary, Stirling wrote just one line that night. "Mission complete. Airfield annihilated. Returning ghosts." The fire at Sidi Hanesh had barely died when the Axis sky woke up in rage. At dawn, reconnaissance planes circled the wreckage, capturing photographs that would reach Rommel's desk within hours. The images showed twisted wings, charred fuselages, and the smoking skeletons of aircraft worth more than an entire desert regiment. The Luftwaffe had been humiliated, and somewhere out there, in the endless gold of the Libyan dunes, a handful of British commandos were vanishing, ghosts in jeeps. By noon, the hunt began. Rommel's intelligence officers sent radio orders to all forward units. Find them. Kill them. No survivors. They believed the attackers were part of a brigade-sized assault unit. In truth, it was 48 men spread across hundreds of miles of desert, low on fuel, water, and sleep. Every direction they turned, the sun burned down with equal hostility. The desert didn't care who you were, German or British. It stripped you to bone and willpower. Captain David Stirling drove at the front of the convoy, his face buried in a scarf, eyes red from sand and exhaustion. Each man had orders: travel light, travel fast, and never stop together. If they were spotted, survival depended on scattering. Confusion was their best armor. By nightfall, the first Luftwaffe patrol found their tracks. 2 Messerschmitts swooped low over the dunes, guns blazing. Bullets chewed the sand around them, cutting through canvas and tires. One jeep was hit. Fuel tank ruptured, flames licking upward. The men inside bailed, diving for the dunes as the vehicle exploded behind them. Sergeant Reg Seekings returned fire with a Vickers K gun, the twin barrels spitting flame. The tracer arcs were almost invisible in daylight, but he hit one plane. A wingtip burst into smoke before it vanished over the horizon. The SAS regrouped at dusk. They had lost 1 jeep, 2 wounded, and most of their water. The heat didn't just burn skin, it cooked the mind. Every horizon looked like a mirage, every shadow a threat. "We hit them harder than they ever expected," Stirling told his men, voice dry, cracked. "Now they'll hit back harder. We keep moving. No stops till dawn." And they did. They drove through the night, engines coughing, wheels tearing over sand like waves. Every few miles, they'd douse their headlights and listen. To the silence, to the wind, to the sound of engines that weren't theirs. For months, Stirling had been the desert's phantom. He'd slipped through patrols, raided airfields, destroyed columns, and vanished without a trace. But the Axis was learning. They began predicting his routes, studying his tactics, setting traps in the dunes. On January 24, 1943, his luck finally ran out. Near Siwa Oasis, Stirling led a small patrol heading north to plan another strike on Benghazi. Unknown to him, Italian Compagnia Sahariana units, elite desert fighters, had been tracking tire marks for 2 days. At dawn, they closed the distance. The ambush came fast. Machine guns erupted from the ridges. Stirling's jeep skidded, swerving into soft sand. He leapt out, returning fire with his Thompson, but the Italians had the high ground. One of his men was hit. Another shouted, "They're closing in!" Stirling turned, scanning the horizon. No cover, no retreat. He ordered his men to scatter. He ran south into the dunes, alone. For 6 hours he crawled through sand and heat, dragging his canteen, his revolver, his last hope. But they found him, exhausted, weapon jammed with grit, surrounded by Italian troops. When they cuffed him, he laughed. "Took you long enough." The man who had founded the Special Air Service, the Ghost of the Desert, was finally captured. They flew him to Benghazi, then on to Rome, and eventually Colditz Castle, the prison for the incorrigible, men who never stopped trying to escape. He made 4 attempts, once by climbing through a latrine pipe, once by pretending to be a German officer, once by swapping uniforms with a French prisoner. Every time caught, but never defeated. Back in the desert, Paddy Mayne took command. He was harder, angrier, and relentless. Under his leadership, the SAS turned from raiders to a full-scale behind-the-lines army, attacking supply convoys, cutting communication cables, and planting explosives on fuel depots at night. Stirling may have been gone, but his spirit, that audacity born from sand and silence, burned in every man who followed him. By the end of 1943, the Axis retreat from North Africa was complete. Rommel's once unstoppable army was broken, starved, outmaneuvered, and blinded from the sky. The seeds sown by Stirling's first raids had grown into a doctrine of war itself. Hit fast, hit hard, disappear. The SAS had proven something that no army had truly believed before, that small, ruthless units operating deep in enemy territory could change the course of an entire campaign. And it all began in the desert, with a few jeeps, a few madmen, and the belief that courage, cunning, and chaos could rewrite the rules of war. When David Stirling was dragged away in chains, many thought the SAS would die with him. They were wrong. If Stirling was the mind of the operation, Paddy Mayne was its soul, violent, unpredictable, and brilliant in chaos. He had been there since the beginning, the Irish rugby player turned commando, a man as feared by his enemies as by his own officers. Stirling had once described him as half-warrior, half-wild animal. Now, with the founder gone, the beast was free to lead. The desert would never be the same again. It was early 1943. The British Eighth Army was pushing west, Rommel's Africa Corps retreating toward Tunisia. But Mayne had no interest in following orders or marching in formation. He believed in the war behind the war, the one fought in silence, in darkness, in places maps didn't even bother to name. He gathered the remnants of Stirling's men, weathered, scarred, sunburnt to leather, and spoke to them by a dying campfire. "They've taken Stirling. Fine, but the SAS doesn't belong to any man. We finish what we started, and we finish it our way." They had barely 50 operational jeeps left, patched together with stolen parts and scavenged metal. Each one carried twin Vickers K guns, extra fuel, and enough ammunition to level an airfield. Every vehicle was painted in dull sand camouflage. No insignia, no markings, no mercy. Mayne split them into small units, each led by veterans who knew the desert like a brother. Their new mission was simple and suicidal: destroy Axis air power wherever it hid. Their next target was Bars, a heavily defended airfield deep in Libya, nearly 1,000 kilometers behind enemy lines. Bars was no small target. It was Rommel's forward air hub, home to dozens of planes, bombers, and fuel dumps. It was madness to attack it, which of course made it irresistible. Mayne led the raid himself. They set off under a moonless sky, driving through wadis and dunes for 3 days, guided only by compass and instinct. Every man rationed water down to half a cup a day. The wind howled, tearing through tents at night like ghosts whispering reminders of home. By the 4th night, they reached the outskirts of Bars. They stopped in silence. Ahead of them, shimmering lights of the airfield, the faint outlines of hangars, the distant murmur of engines being serviced. Mayne whispered, "No noise, no hesitation. In and out before they know we were ever here." At OI 100 hours, the SAS stormed the base. Jeeps tore across the tarmac, machine guns blazing. Mayne stood upright in his vehicle, firing a Bren gun from the hip, screaming like a man possessed. The Germans were caught mid-slumber. Mechanics running half-dressed, officers stumbling from barracks, alarm sirens wailing too late. They planted Lewis bombs on aircraft wings and fuel dumps, each ticking like a heartbeat. The first explosion hit an ammunition truck. The fireball lit the sky like a rising sun. Flames spread from hangar to hangar, consuming dozens of aircraft before the first German defense guns even opened fire. Within minutes, the airfield became an inferno. Engines melted, wings folded, bombs detonated in chain reactions that shook the desert for miles. Mayne's Jeep was the last to leave, his face streaked with soot, eyes glowing under the firelight. "Bars is gone," one of his men whispered over the radio. "Then drive," Mayne replied, "before they bring hell down on us." As they raced out of Bars, Luftwaffe spotlights scanned the desert, machine guns ripping through the dark. One Jeep was hit, fuel tank ignited. A column of flame erupted behind them. Still they didn't stop. Stopping meant death. They drove through the night, engines screaming, sand whipping against their faces like knives. At dawn, they reached a canyon where they hid beneath camouflage nets, covering the jeeps with branches and sand. Above them, German planes circled, searching, hunting, furious. But they found nothing. The SAS had once again disappeared into the desert, ghosts fading back into myth. That night, as they checked their gear and wounds, Mayne sat alone. He looked toward the horizon, where Bars still glowed faintly, a red smear against the sky. For the first time since Stirling's capture, he smiled, not because of victory, but because he realized something profound. The SAS had evolved. It was no longer a handful of daring raiders. It was a philosophy, a new kind of warfare, born from desperation and sustained by defiance. But not all made it home. Several jeeps went missing. One was ambushed near Derna, another ran out of fuel and was surrounded by Italian troops. Captured SAS men were often executed on sight. Rommel had issued secret orders. Commandos operating out of uniform were terrorists, not soldiers. At Derna prison, an SAS soldier named Sergeant Jack Byrne refused to speak under torture. When the Italians demanded to know who led the raid, he spat blood and said, "The desert did." He was shot the next morning. When Mayne learned of it weeks later, he ordered another raid, this time on the convoy transporting prisoners from Derna to Tobruk. They ambushed it at dusk. Every prisoner rescued. Every guard dead. It was brutal, personal, and poetic. By mid-1943, Rommel was retreating into Tunisia, the Allies closing in. The SAS, now integrated into the Long-Range Desert Group, LRDG, continued raiding, cutting off supply lines, destroying trucks, and harassing columns. They became more than a unit. They were a rumor, A nightmare whispered in Axis ranks. "Beware the jeeps," the Germans said. "They come at night, with no headlights, and they kill before you hear them." Even Rommel, the desert fox, reportedly admired them, calling them a perfect enemy. Invisible, unpredictable, and without fear. The sands of North Africa were soaked with oil, fire, and blood, and from those sands a legend was born, one that would live long after the Desert War was over. By the spring of 1943, the North African desert had gone silent. Rommel's once mighty Africa Corps was broken, shattered by months of Allied pressure, starvation, and the relentless raids that tore its heart from within. The endless sandstorms that once hid the SAS now covered wreckage, twisted wings, burned-out trucks, and the ghosts of both armies. For the men who had lived and fought in that wasteland, the war was not over. It had merely changed shape. After Tunisia fell in May 1943, what was left of the SAS, fewer than 200 battle-hardened raiders, was recalled to Britain. Their arrival at Inverary, Scotland was surreal. The cold, damp hills were a cruel contrast to the burning dunes they'd once called home, but their reputation had arrived before they did. Generals wanted to know how a handful of men had destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft, supply lines, and outposts, how they had survived months without proper rations or reinforcement, how they had done what entire divisions couldn't. The answer, as Paddy Mayne would later tell a British officer, was simple. "We didn't fight like an army. We fought like hunters." It was that spirit that now caught the attention of Allied High Command. The SAS was to be reformed and redeployed, no longer a rogue desert experiment, but a precision tool of sabotage and intelligence behind enemy lines. Their new targets occupied Europe. But in Europe, the rules were different. There were forests instead of dunes, snow instead of sand. The SAS now had to adapt to parachute drops, resistance coordination, and behind-the-lines assassinations. In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for D-Day, SAS units were quietly inserted into France, often weeks before the invasion. Their mission: disrupt German reinforcements, destroy railways, and make the enemy believe there were entire divisions operating behind them. The code names were simple but legendary: Operation Bulbasket, Houndsworth, Leuthen. In one mission, Major Mayne personally led a raid against a German HQ near Oldenburg, driving through enemy lines in a captured truck, dressed as an officer. He and his men destroyed communications, fuel dumps, and killed dozens of SS troops before vanishing into the countryside. He'd later receive his 4th Distinguished Service Order, the only British soldier in history to do so, but the victories came at terrible cost. Captured SAS men were tortured, executed, or sent to concentration camps. In July 1944, 34 SAS members were captured near Dijon and summarily executed by the SS. Their bodies found bound and shot through the head. For every raid that succeeded, another ended in silence. By 1945, the war's tide had turned. Berlin was collapsing, the Reich in ruins. But for Mayne, there was no sense of triumph. He'd lost too many men, comrades who had fought like brothers under the desert sun. In April, during one of the final operations in Germany, his convoy was ambushed. Mayne personally charged a German machine gun nest, rescuing a trapped patrol under heavy fire. He would be recommended for the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valor. The recommendation was denied. Some said for political reasons, others because his style of war didn't fit the traditional mold of heroism. To the men who followed him, that didn't matter. He was already a legend. He had the courage of 10 men, one survivor later said, and the soul of one who'd already made peace with death. After the war, Mayne returned to Northern Ireland, restless, haunted, and unable to adjust to civilian life. He died in a car crash in 1955 at just 40 years old. But his legacy lived on, not in medals or monuments, but in every soldier who dared to fight unconventionally. The SAS disbanded briefly in 1945, but the world had already changed because of them. Their tactics, mobility, sabotage, deep reconnaissance, and shock raids became the blueprint for every modern Special Forces unit to follow. The U.S. Green Berets, Navy SEALs, French GIGN, Israeli Sayeret Matkal all traced their lineage back to the ragtag desert raiders who refused to fight like gentlemen. Their motto, "Who dares wins," became a creed. A simple sentence, born out of Stirling's defiance, carved into the soul of every warrior who believed in courage over conformity. The SAS was revived in 1947, officially recognized as part of the British Army. Its first modern commander? One of Stirling's original men, who had once driven a jeep through a storm of tracer fire at Bars. Today, the sands of North Africa hold little trace of that war. The airfields at Sidi Hanesh and Bars are empty. The desert winds have covered the craters and erased the tire tracks. But if you stand there long enough under the blazing sun, you can almost hear it. The faint roar of engines, the staccato of gunfire, the voices shouting over the wind, and maybe, just maybe, a whisper of Mayne's voice. We didn't do it for glory. We did it so the enemy would never sleep easy again. For men like Stirling and Mayne, the war never truly ended. It simply lived on. In every raid, every mission, every soldier who dared to fight the impossible fight. Because history may forget battles, but it never forgets those who fought without fear.